Hello and welcome to another episode of the TLDR Global Podcast. As usual, I am Zac Michaelis, TLDR's Editor-in-Chief, and I'm joined today by TLDR Global's lead writer, Rory Taylor.
Hello.
Hello, how are we doing today?
Good. Yeah,
Good.
Another two-man podcast.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. We had some technical difficulties. It's supposed to be a three-man with Jack, but unfortunately, we can only got two mics working, so yeah, what are you going to do? Anyway, in today's podcast, the main story is going to be about Trump, and it's going to be both about the fact that Trump has just won in New Hampshire and now looks pretty dead set to be the Republican nominee for 2024. The polling is also pretty good for him head-to-head against Biden, so there's a very good chance he ends up as US president. But we're not just going to be talking about Trump, we're also going to be talking about the European reaction to the prospect of yet another Trump presidency. But before we get into that, as is custom on this podcast, we're going to start with our underreported story. So, Rory, what is your unreported story?
So mine is, it's not a hugely consequential one, if I'm totally honest. It's just a kind of mildly interesting, fun one. Yeah. So, as you said, it was a New Hampshire primary yesterday, I think, as day of recording. But so obviously the Republican one got all the attention. The Democrats also sort of had a primary. But it was very weird. Joe Biden won it, but he wasn't even on the ballot. And there were no state delegates awarded for it because of this very odd situation that happened. So the individual states, there's like an order that they go through when they have their primaries and caucuses. And New Hampshire is usually one of the first ones. Yeah. But this time around, New Hampshire, the Democrats in New Hampshire tried to kind of jump the gun and place themselves right in first place. And the Democratic Party kind of headquarters didn't like that because it wasn't going with their official timetable. So they punished New Hampshire and said, we're not going to let you award any delegates because you've done this. So because of that, it was sort of this official, unofficial primary. And the Biden campaign didn't even try and get their name on the ballot. So it was effectively a blank ballot and it was all write-ins. So they managed to win by people writing in the name Joe Biden. It also meant there was it sort of gave a slightly higher chance for those minor candidates trying to challenge him. Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson and some others, they obviously didn't come to anything, but that was probably their best chance to get some headlines, if they actually got a pretty good showing there. But it wouldn't have mattered really because no delegates were awarded. So we had this weird thing where Biden wasn't even on the ballot and he won the primary in New Hampshire, but it doesn't really matter because there were no delegates awarded. But ultimately, he's going to be the nominee, assuming he kind of
There's some
stays
real,
healthy.
like die-hard Biden super fans writing in despite it not meaning anything.
Yeah, exactly.
That's funny. You're right. All the attention obviously has been paid to the Republican one. My unreported story it's a bit late actually. It sort of happened in early January, but it's about Norway granting licenses for deep sea mining. Norway's been granting more licenses for like natural gas exploration in not just the North Sea, which is sort of between Norway and the UK, but also the Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea, which are basically the two sort of seas north of Norway, in between Norway and the Arctic. But Norway has now recently granted deep sea mining licenses, or at least said that it's open to deep sea mining, for not oil or gas, but for like precious metals. And this basically is because on the surface of the Barents and North Seas, not on the surface, on the sort of the bottom, the seabed, there are these deposits of certain metals like cobalt, scandium, and lithium and stuff like that that are supposed to be very important for the energy transition. And Norway has obviously seen that the price of these metals is really, really going up very, very fast, but also because obviously there's a lot of demand for them as part of the energy transition. They're used for stuff like batteries and electric cars and various other bits of like high-end technology. But also they're sourced from very unreliable places. So, for example, a lot of the cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Yeah. And, it's not the most politically stable place in the world. And I think this is interesting for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it's provoked a bit of an uproar in parts of Norway. Because there's like an environmental angle to it. People are worried about the ecological impacts. It's also worth saying that both the EU and the UK have said they're against commercial deep sea mining for those sort of things. But I think it's more interesting for two reasons. One, a lot of this debate about like the scarcity of lithium, cobalt, stuff like that, mirrors a debate that happened about oil in the end of the 20th century, when that was like the most important energy commodity. And people kept on saying, we've reached peak oil. That was the turn of phrase they used. Like, there's not going to be enough of it. We've got to stop using oil because we're going to run out. And we kept on finding new sources of oil. I mean, most of the big discoveries did happen in the early part of the 20th century, but we kept on finding stuff the latter half. And then we obviously had the shale oil boom in the 2010s. And something very similar is happening with lithium, especially. So lithium, there was all this chat about we're going to run out of lithium. The cost of batteries is going to skyrocket.
Yeah.
And it's actually gone down. And part of this is because we've just found more lithium deposits. Demand has gone up and we've started looking around a bit more. There's a really good piece by Hannah Ritchie, she does the World in Data, about sort of peak lithium and the fact that we keep on finding more of these rare earth minerals. And it's annoying for me because I've always been a big advocate of nuclear power because I thought we were going to run out of lithium and so it was too expensive. So I've lost that battle. But it's good for humanity that we're finding new sources of these like critically important minerals and metals for the energy transition. And I also think it reminds us that there is a geopolitics to the energy future, to the energy transition.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of Europe hopes that moving away from oil and gas can give Europe energy independence. It can sort of gift us an independence from like Russian gas and American oil and the Middle Eastern oil and that sort of thing, and all the sort of difficulties that come with those dependencies. But I think that that's probably a bit naive. And in the end, all of the bits of basically renewable energy still requires commodities, still requires manufacturing, and that's still done in difficult, geopolitically contentious places. We still rely a lot, for example, on China for our like solar panels and our wind panels, and it's not as simple as just like, we can just make them all here. Yeah. And at the very sort of the most basic level, we still rely on commodities mined in places like the Congo, in places like Russia, and so this is a sort of like there's a tacit realization that we need to find our own domestic sources of these like critically important energy minerals, which have sort of like replaced oil as like the strategically significant energy commodity. And the last thing I think is interesting, can make Norway even wealthier. I mean, Norway is just scandalously rich. Like the sovereign wealth fund has something like 200,000 euros for every Norwegian. Man, they've got even more.
They can just top it up now with
it's
lithium
unbelievable.
Wealth.
We're jealous, very jealous. Anyway, those are the unreported stories. Now to the main bit of the video. We're talking about Trump, and obviously, as Rory mentioned a second ago, we've just had the New Hampshire primary. If it wasn't already abundantly clear after Iowa, it has become sort of just totally apparent that Trump is almost definitely going to be the Republican nominee in 2024. He beat Nikki Haley by, I think, like a projected 11 points. I don't know if we've got the final results now. And New Hampshire is supposed to be like a very pro-Nikki Haley state. Nikki Haley overperforms with basically like educated, high-income Republicans, and New Hampshire has a lot more like educated, high-income Republicans than most of the other states that we're going to see in the next couple of days. And the fact that she still lost to Trump there really suggests that she doesn't really stand a chance. If she can't win in New Hampshire, she almost definitely can't win in any of the other relevant states. And so I guess the main question is, let's just assume Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. Yeah. What does the polling say? Does that mean that Trump could win in 2024? We could have a second term of President Trump?
I mean, we definitely could, yeah. And polling, if you're in the Biden camp, you might be slightly worried about the polling because head-to-head, Trump does seem to be leading Biden. It obviously is looking head-to-head in the swing states is more important than just looking nationally. But there are, polls do range, but in places like Michigan, where Biden won last time round, and he'll definitely need to win this time round, there was a poll recently where Trump was leading him, and that's the case for lots of other swing states. It's not. The difficulty is it's a toss-up, really. It could go either way, and there's still a long time to go before the actual election itself. So, I can't say what's going to happen, but if you say could Trump win, he absolutely could win. And as we'll get on to, I think European politicians are starting to prepare for that. Possibility.
I think one of the things that you're right, polling is almost like irrelevant at this point. Like it's just so far out, it doesn't really have much predictive power. I think one interesting thing that I've noticed in the sort of like polling and the discourse around 2024 is that there is a divide between what the polls say and what the forecasters say. So I don't know how much people know about this, but one of the things like Dominic Cummings was very big into in the UK was this idea of super forecasters. It's basically people who have very good record at predicting events. And you basically get them in a room, or like an internet room equivalent, and you get them to make their forecast, and you aggregate them. And there are a whole lot of websites that do this, like Metacalculus is one. There's a place called Good Judgment that does it as well. And very, very often, these like markets, these predictive markets, have far better predictive power than polls, for example. Normally, there's a bit of a correlation. Like, if the super forecasters, the forecasting communities, as it were, thinks that Starmer will win, unsurprisingly, in 2024, as the polls suggest. So, like, you know, there's a relationship between two, but there is more of a divide on the question of who wins in 2024 between the forecasters and the polls than there is in other races, because basically the polls do suggest at the moment that Trump has a slight edge in the relevant states. But the forecasting communities, well, I don't know how best to describe them, super forecasters feels a bit grandiose, but they reliably give Biden a slight edge on that. And I think that's just because if you sort of imagine how the next 9 months play out, like there's a good chance Trump's legal woes catch up with them even more than they have done. I do think Biden might get a bit more credit for the economy, finally. I think a lot depends on like the foreign policy, geopolitical situation, but you can't really predict how that pans out anyway. So I think that is like a note of optimism for those Europeans who are worried about the Trump presidency.
I think there's also... I was reading about all the recent special elections that have happened in the States where Democrats have consistently overperformed. Yeah. And, you know, all of these races will have local elements, but that's a good sign of Democrats going into the November election because it shows that the issues like abortion are still very like prevalent in people's minds when they go to vote. And if the Democrats and Biden can use that in their election campaign, then they have a good chance of kind of turning things around.
It's also because Democrats have a better like reputation, better public appeal than Republicans as parties. Yeah. But whether or not how much that difference it makes in a sort of head-to-head presidential matchup between Biden and Trump, you know, just no one really knows yet. I think the other thing is worth saying is that I do think that Trump is probably a worse media performer than people remember. I think there's quite good evidence that Trump has lost some of his sort of like rhetorical edge over the years. You do see him make some quite sort of conspicuous slip-ups. I mean, again, he's pretty old as well. He's 80 or whatever.
Biden... Republicans will always go after Biden because of his age and his kind of gaffes, but
so
Biden campaign is now going after Trump for the same thing. And we're going to get into this point where we've got like two old men within a couple of years of each other just accusing each other of being the most senile. And it's not a great way to run an election. Again,
it's not a hot take, but it's quite sad that it comes to this, isn't it? Yeah. You forget that it was Romney Obama, like not very, that's what, a decade and a bit ago.
Like, so youthful compared to this one.
Admit that amazing stat that Macron and Attal together are still younger than both of them. Anyway, so you mentioned a second ago the Europeans are preparing for this. What do you mean by preparing? What have we seen so far?
So one quite good quote that made the news in the last few days was from the Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo. I'm just going to read it verbatim. He says, if 2024 brings us America first, as in Trump again, it will be more than ever Europe on its own. We should, as Europeans, not fear that prospect. We should embrace it. Europe must become stronger, more sovereign, and more self-reliant. So he's effectively saying, if Trump does win the presidency again, we can no longer rely on the US for, security as we used to. And in terms of economics also, like Europe will have to kind of be more... What's the word? Strategic.
Strategic autonomy.
Yeah, strategically autonomous. So that's the kind of eventuality they're looking at, that Europe will kind of have to go it alone. And we kind of saw that did kind of happen during the first Trump presidency, but I think when Biden came back in, there was this when Biden came in 2020, there was this kind of sigh of relief in Europe, but I don't think that fully, that didn't stop Europe from trying to move towards strategic autonomy, but maybe it just let them rest on their laurels slightly.
That point is really interesting about like people have really interpreted. So the like popular reading of the past 4 years when it comes to like transatlantic relationships is that Biden represents this high point in Europe-America relations, especially sort of sandwiched between a Trump presidency and a potential Trump presidency. Yeah. I'm not sure that's really true. I think they reach a high point after Ukraine. Yeah. There's clearly sort of like complete agreement on Ukraine. But I think in the last year or so, I think you've actually already seen the Europeans get more increasingly wary about their over-reliance on the US. I mean, that's partly because American support for Ukraine has not waned or like dwindled. I mean, the White House is still very like pro-Ukraine, but there are political hurdles to that support, especially in Congress. And that has made the Europeans wary. But I think there have been another couple of things that have really strained, no one's really noticed, I don't think, but they have really strained European-American relations. And one of them, I think, is the Inflation Reduction Act, which people don't really think about. Well, that's not true. A lot of people talk about it, but I think the Biden administration didn't really think about the impact it would have on EU-America relations when they passed it. They saw it as just like, the Europeans always talk about green energy. Surely they'll love this thing we're doing to help us improve our green energy. We normally produce all this oil and coal or oil and gas, whatever. But obviously, that's not how the IRA went down in Europe. People, especially Macron, were furious because they saw the Inflation Reduction Act basically had these enormous subsidy schemes for all these renewable energies. They just worried that European renewable energy companies, were just going to flee to America to make use of these massive subsidies that the Europeans just can't afford. We don't have as much fiscal space as the Americans. The Americans can afford to pour, I make this point so often, but I really think it is very, very important. They can afford to pour billions of dollars into nuclear power, into wind energy, into solar, into batteries, into semiconductors. We just don't have that, or at least we don't have the political appetite for that kind of borrowing. And so I think that was the first bit, and I think that really upset Macron, but it also upset the Germans, because the Germans are very worried about deindustrialization. The German economy is obviously based on quite heavy industries and exporting like stuff like cars, obviously, and various like manufactured parts. And they've suffered a little bit recently, partly because of the withdrawal of Russian gas, but also because of the rise of protectionism across the world. And the Germans have always been very big advocates of free markets. You saw that actually in some of the comments that Scholz made last year when he was basically pushing back against Macron's efforts to start an EU investigation into Chinese cars and basically accusing the Chinese of protectionism. So it's upset both. I think the IRA was a point of tension. I also think that the French have always been obviously less pro-American than, let's say, the Germans. And I think the balance of power within the EU is shifting away from Germany, I think partly because obviously Scholz is very, very unpopular. Also not really an international politician. He's quite a quiet politician. But also because Germany's economy is struggling. And some of German foreign policy looks a little bit complacent in light of Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine. And at the same time, I know Macron is very, very unpopular, but he has a reputation as a statesman. He's sort of filled the political void there. So I think the balance of power is shifting towards France, and therefore Europe is also shifting away from America a little bit. And the final thing I think is worth mentioning is I think we're going to get to this, but is Israel. And I do think that, sure, many European countries have been pretty pro-Israel, and they've been pretty much on side with what the Americans have wanted. But you've seen that European support has waned faster than American support for Israel. And I think you're also seeing that Europeans are being reminded of the fact that there is just an asymmetry in the Middle East, in that America has more power, but it's insulated from its worst effects. So if there is a further escalation in the Middle East or some sort of humanitarian crisis, the countries that are affected from the increased risk of terrorism, for example, and increased migration flows, which are already proving politically contentious in Europe, are the Europeans. And also the countries that are affected when it comes to oil and gas are the Europeans, because we're the ones who import all our oil from the Persian Gulf, from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait, all our gas, by the way, from Qatar. The gas from Qatar is already, I should flesh this out a little bit. France, Germany, and Italy, I think, France, Italy, and one of the Netherlands, I think. One of them. France, Italy, and the Netherlands, I'm going to say, have all signed 27-year natural gas deals with Qatar. 27 years. That's until 2050. That is enormous. We are really, really reliant on Qatar for our natural gas. And natural gas is going to become even more important. It's like a bridge fuel while we make the energy transition, because it has lower CO2 emissions than oil. So we're using it while we wean ourselves off oil to reduce our CO2 emissions before we get to like a fully renewable future, if we ever get there. And the places where you can get gas, there's basically three, maybe four if we include Qatar. But it's Russia, we can't do that. It's Iran, we can't do that at the moment. And then it's America. But that's complicated in part because America sort of wants to keep its gas for itself. And so we've all turned to this tiny little Gulf state, Qatar, because it has some of the world's biggest natural gas reserves. And that's fine, it makes geopolitical sense. But it means that we are singularly reliant on this one state that exports all its stuff via the Red Sea up through the Suez Canal. And Qatar has already said in the last couple of days, we're going to have to at least slow that's all right, shipments of natural gas, liquefied natural gas to Europe, because we can no longer go through the Red Sea. And I think basically, this is again such a rant, but this whole affair has reminded us that actually when it comes to the Middle East, Europe and the US just do have different, in some cases, competing strategic interests, and that can create tension. So I think that actually you've already seen tensions emerge in the American-European relationship, and I think that obviously the prospect of Trump presidency could strain those further.
I was just going to jump in because there was an interesting dynamic with the US and UK strikes on the Houthis in Yemen, that European leaders were pretty quiet or cautious in responding to those. They notably didn't take part in them. And they also didn't really welcome them. They just kept urging de-escalation and calm.
Yeah.
And I think that was quite a visible divide between the two blocs.
Also worth mentioning that there's this Operation Prosperity, and sure, a lot of European countries are nominally signed up for that, but in its most recent statement, which was basically attacking the Houthis and condemning Iran, mainly the Houthis, but tacitly Iran, the French conspicuously refused to sign that latest statement. So if you look, you can see tensions emerging within Europe, but also between Europe and the US. I think the next thing to talk about is actually basically ask, if Trump were to come in, what would Trump's foreign policy be? And I guess the one that gets most coverage is Ukraine. Yeah. So do we have any sense of what Trump would do on Ukraine?
It's so difficult with Trump because he will say contradictory things. He will say he's got plans for some things without fleshing them out. He's very hard to predict. But fundamentally with Ukraine, the question is, will Trump keep supporting Ukraine in the way that Biden has?
Yeah. And
his answer has generally been like, well, I'll end the war in 24 hours, so it doesn't really matter.
Love it.
And that's not an answer. But if the Republican Party is anything to go by, especially his wing of the party, then they are much less supportive of Ukraine than Biden and the Democrats have been. So I think that is a real risk for Ukraine, Zelensky, and I guess the European kind of pro-Ukraine project, that Trump could completely just turn the whole thing on its head.
I think you're right though, that the best way I think the word used is unreliable.
Yeah.
That is the best way of characterizing Trump's foreign policy. Like, I think he has competing instincts. He has an isolationist instinct in that he wants to just get America out of the forever wars.
Yeah.
I think it's like, it's a sort of revamped version of Obama's foreign policy in 2007 when he said something like, don't do stupid stuff. Yeah. And it's the same idea. It's just like, what are we doing?
What does that mean?
Yeah, let's just get out of everything.
Yeah.
But then he also has this sort of like American power instinct, which is that he wants to like exhibit, he wants to sort of like show the world how powerful America is. And they often push in different directions.
It's very odd because he's sort of an isolationist, but also is the kind of person who thinks America can and maybe should go and like bomb places into submission or like use their kind of power to get their way. But those they're not consistent positions to hold.
I think that's what actually provokes anxiety in Europe. I mean, in a sense, it would be better if we just knew that Trump was going to pull out of Ukraine. Yeah. We'd at least know what to plan for.
Yeah.
But I think I mentioned this before, but in that interview on Fox News talking about his Ukraine policy, he says, I'll solve the war in 24 hours. And the person says, well, what if you don't? And he says, I'll give the Ukraine bigger weapons they've ever seen.
Yeah.
And like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, Ukraine should hear that and think, great. But like, they can't hear that and think, well, that's going to happen.
Yeah, because it's just unreliable. And I guess that's why Europeans are so anxious about it. I think you saw something similar. Again, I think this was underreported in his comments on Taiwan, where a couple of days ago he was asked by Fox News, like, would you invade?
Would you defend Taiwan
in the event of a Chinese invasion? And his response was, it was quite telling, actually.
I have the whole quote here.
Yeah, I would love to hear the whole quote. Go on.
He said, Taiwan took all of our chip business. We used to make all of our own chips. Now they're made in Taiwan. 90% of them. Remember this. Taiwan took smart, brilliant. They took our business away. So I don't know if I got the intonation right, but yeah. He didn't answer he didn't answer the question as that will he defend Taiwan? But by not answering it, it's quite an obvious sense. You get a sense of where his head is at on that.
Yeah, I think the other thing, by the way, though, is before that he says, "I can't tell you because that would give away my like negotiating power," which is interesting because there's a truth to that. There's a truth to the fact that like, the mad dictator theory or the mad tyrant theory of foreign policy, which is just that like, if no one knows what you're going to do and you're very, very unpredictable, they'll be scared of upsetting you. Yeah. And there's something to that, but it makes it very hard for your allies, especially in Europe, because if you're abiding by that sort of mad tyrant theory of foreign policy, no one can plan ahead, and Europe basically has to ensure against the worst possible outcomes.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about NATO at all in that kind of sphere?
Because we should definitely talk about that. What have you got? You got the Middle East and NATO on your thing.
Yes, NATO.
Can we finish on NATO? I want to say one more thing on the Middle East. Basically, at the moment, we have this crisis in the Red Sea. The Houthis obviously attacking commercial maritime traffic that's going up through the Bab al-Mandab Strait, through the Red Sea, then through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, then Europe. Yeah, and there are two basically big bits of trade that run through this route. There are oil exports from Persian Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia that then go through to Europe, which is obviously like an oil-consuming continent. And then also that is the main trade passage for European trade with East Asia, including China. And obviously Europe and China do a lot of trade together, so a lot of trade flows through that. And there's something like 20 to 30% of all global maritime trade, therefore, flows through the Red Sea. So we've got this Red Sea crisis, and what's happened here is this has reminded the world of the very important role that the US Navy plays in basically guaranteeing maritime trade across the globe. So that the US Navy is sort of tacitly or implicitly says, I'm going to make sure that commercial ships can transit through these waters so that we can have frictionless global trade, which is sort of a good thing. And I think it's really, really interesting that this has been taken as a given since World War II. Every American president's basically said, fine, this is what we do. We are like the sort of advocates and therefore the protectors of free trade. And in 2019, Trump came in and basically said, why are we doing this? Like, why are we protecting a trade route which, at the end of the day, mainly benefits China? Because, especially if you're talking about the Persian Gulf, which is not the same as the Red Sea, it's just to the east of that, on the other side of Saudi Arabia, that is where all of the oil from places like Saudi Arabia and Iran goes through to China. China is a big oil consumer, has been since the 90s. It needs it for the tons of manufacturing it does. And Trump, in 2019, puts out this tweet where he goes, what are we doing in the Persian Gulf? Why? I think it comes just after Iran or one of the Houthis attack a Saudi oil facility. And it's basically after Trump reimposes sanctions and there's some tension in the Persian Gulf. And he says, well, why are we there? We don't need this oil. Why are we protecting Chinese oil imports? And the answer to that question, by the way, even from Trump's perspective, is that the alternative is the Chinese protecting Chinese oil exports. And I don't think the Americans would be entirely comfortable with the Chinese playing the role of international trade guarantor. But it would be really interesting if you just imagine that counterfactual. Imagine Trump is in now and we get this chaos on the Red Sea. Would you expect Trump to come, a Trump-led US Navy to come and protect trade? I mean, if the answer is no, then all of a sudden, basically, Europe's life looks a lot more difficult, because if there's no effort to protect trade going through there, then everything has to be redirected. And then all of a sudden, we do have to pay higher shipping costs. And just more generally, for a country that relies, a continent even, Europe, that relies so heavily on strategic imports, the fact that maritime trade would be sort of vulnerable, generally vulnerable, if the US withdraws from its role as a sort of maritime trade guarantor, that's a far more precarious geopolitical and economic situation. So I just think that's really interesting. I think in a way, it would be very, very interesting just to have Trump in for this very particular crisis, because something he complained about very directly in 2019. And could then quieten down about. But I do think this would be an interesting test case to see between what the differences between Biden and Trump would be.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that he made those remarks and then kind of quietened down. I think that the thing with Trump's first term was that a lot of his instincts and more like controversial things he might have wanted to do were slightly tempered by the people around him. But I think going into a potential second term, he's going to be surrounded by a lot more like-minded people and people who are probably more extreme than the people he had in his first term. Yeah. And the risk is that the people that were tempering him aren't there anymore. And, that means those kind of random thoughts he has on a Wednesday evening might turn into policy rather than just a comment that he made. No,
there's lots of reports he already has a team around him who are there to facilitate his most extreme plans, especially domestically. I don't know how much there's about foreign policy. People often talk about one of the things that does seem to come up regularly in Trump foreign policy circles is this idea that America can't do everything. I think that is pretty key to the way that Trump's circle think about foreign policy. Elbridge Colby is a very prominent writer on this topic, and he is probably going to be part of the Trump inner circle. And he's been arguing for a long time that basically the US cannot do Ukraine and Taiwan. So he's just been, and that's not actually that controversial position. I mean, that is sort of the subtext to the Obama foreign policy. It's just that we can't do the Middle East and China. We're doing a pivot to Asia. That's the whole point of the pivot. But it's nonetheless a pretty worrying thing for European politicians to hear. And Elbridge Colby has now been saying, well, we definitely can't do Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. And I think that's the starkest difference. I mean, it's a weird that Biden is the one who's saying we can do all three of those things. He has said that explicitly. I mean, he has that amazing quote where he's like, we're the strongest country in the history of the world. Of course, we can fight three massive wars. But I do think that is one difference between the Biden and Trump, at least potential administrations. Anyway, NATO.
So Trump
that was not a prompt at all, but NATO.
NATO. Trump has over the years been very critical of NATO in various forms. Critical of other NATO members for not paying their 2% of defense budget. Critical because he thinks it's just a way of drawing the US into wars that it shouldn't be drawn into. Lots of reasons, but I think there's this fear with a second Trump presidency among NATO members that Trump might try and just unilaterally pull out of NATO or openly say, actually, we won't abide by Article 5. You won't come to a member state's defense if they're attacked.
Well, people question the legality of leaving NATO.
Yeah.
That's sort of a redundant conversation, isn't it? I mean, if he said that, then that's...
You can stay in it, but just not
do anything.
Yeah, refuse to take part. And so there was this quote that... So France's EU commissioner revealed that Trump said to him and to Ursula von der Leyen back in 2020, allegedly Trump said, "You need to understand if Europe is under attack, we will never come to help you and to support you. By the way, NATO is dead and we will leave, we'll quit NATO." He allegedly said these things to very high profile Europeans, and whether he does that or not, that's just those words alone seriously undermines the whole concept, the whole principle of NATO. And so the US Congress actually in their latest military spending bill, they included a provision that effectively bars the president from unilaterally withdrawing from NATO as a kind of defense against that. But like you said, that only kind of protects against that withdrawal. It doesn't mean he has to abide by Article 5 or whatever. But I think NATO would be undermined by a second Trump presidency, to say the least. Yeah. And that factors into the whole European strategic autonomy thing. That will push the cause for like a European army or at least European security alliance of some form. That will just kind of galvanize that movement, I think.
And I think Europe is moving towards that a little bit. I think that you see this sort of like split. There's obviously always been the Germany-France split over how seriously or how load-bearing the EU should be as a security vector.
Yeah.
But more recently, there's been a more acute split between like Eastern Europe and France, because even if the Eastern Europeans are more sort of like pro-defense, they spend more on their defense, they've always been very wary of taking directions from the French, and they much prefer to be sort of alongside the Americans. Poland is the best case. Poland is obviously very, very strongly pro-American and very skeptical of the French. But I do think you're right. I think if Trump gets in, I do think Europe will just have to take its security more seriously, and it will have to develop an independent security structure. The EU will have to become more load-bearing in that respect. I think you already see the beginnings of this preparation being made in the fact that both France and the UK have now signed bilateral deals in just the past month. Actually, I think Macron is off to Ukraine in February to finalise it.
Yeah.
But they are going to sign bilateral security agreements with Ukraine. And that is in some sense a sort of like it's preparing, it's hedging for a Trump presidency. I just think it's one of those things where, and this is my bias coming through here. Macron was right. He was right. Of course he was right. Europe did have to, I just do think that Europe should have taken its own security more seriously. And I think that you're right. If there is a Trump presidency, we will see the EU taking on a more like active security posture. The last thing I'll say about that is I think in a way, Brexit, it's just an interesting way these things interact. I think Brexit has sort of helped that. I think that one of the main impediments to an independent European security infrastructure was the UK. The UK is like maybe it's one of the biggest, them and France, the biggest army in Europe, but the UK has always been very wary about committing to like an integrated European army or whatever it is. There was actually some movement towards that, by the way, done by Tony Blair back in like 2005, or maybe even a bit earlier actually, and then it all collapses because of Iraq. And then that's when the Brits and the French really fall out. But yeah, I think that is an interesting like point to make, is that actually I think maybe there is a bit more political space for the EU to take its own security more seriously because the UK is sort of out the way in that
Do you
respect.
think in, 50 years' time, there'll be like a history and politics exam question that says Donald Trump and Brexit were the biggest drivers of European integration in the 2010s and 2020s or something?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Of King of Europe, Macron. That's what created the space for it. I think that's it. I think it's always interesting to think about like the Brexit counterfactuals, about how different things would look if the UK was still in the EU. I also think it's interesting to see how Starmer wants to relate to what is
Yeah.
an EU that is more of a security or more load-bearing in security terms than it was during Brexit, when the EU was considered, at least in like British public discourse, it was perceived as primarily an economic union. And if it's more of a security union, you know, what sort of relationship does Starmer build there with the EU? But these are all questions that are clearly far too big for teenagers like us. So I think that is everything, unless there's anything else you want to talk about. No? Well, thank you very much for...
No, there is the global leaderboard.
Fuck, of course. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry.
I don't forget that. That's the best bit of the pod. Okay. Hello and welcome to the Global Leaderboard.
We'll make it quick.
Where we basically put someone up and someone down. Again, as always, just to make this clear, this is not a reflection of personal politics. This is just from that particular individual perspective, had they had a good week or a bad week, or seems to be the last of the podcast. So, Rory, who is going down?
I'm moving Donald Tusk down. He's, he must be in his first month and a half as new Polish Prime Minister. And I think he's learning that, he knew this before, that kind of unpicking and undoing the things that the Law and Justice Administration had done is going to be a lot harder than many people might have thought. So the thing in particular from last week has been that a tribunal has deemed his overhaul of the media system as unlawful, effectively. And that's just, I don't need to go into it too much. It's quite obvious why that's bad for him. But I think it's just, he's got a very difficult task ahead to try and revert back to what it was before Law and Justice came in. Yeah,
but I saw that, and I sort of have two competing thoughts about this. I should say that we did a video on this about Poland's like political crisis, and I don't think we made enough of this. I don't think we did enough sort of like both siding it. But like, sure, everyone's been like, oh, what a hypocrite! Like, he's had a go at Law and Justice for being unconstitutional, and then he's gone broken the law himself. I sort of half by that, but then I also sort of think like, unpicking this in like any reasonable amount of time is just going to require you to move fast and break things. Like, it just is. I don't feel any queasiness about, and maybe this is, again, it's an opinion. This is not the opinion of the channel. But I actually think it's the right thing to do. I quite like that he's like pushing the boundaries of constitutionality and legality to get it done as fast as possible. I think it would make the PIS's point if he just had stuck so like stubbornly within the laws of like convention, or within like the boundaries of convention, and then just didn't get it done. It would just make his whole premiership, his whole project redundant.
It's also worth pointing out that the court that said his reform was unlawful is entirely appointed by Law and Justice, the Law and Justice government. So like, it
creates this really uncomfortable grey zone, doesn't it? Where it's very, very unclear about how to like evaluate it. Like, is he doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Because like, is it legal? But then again, like, what does legal mean once you've had a legal system that's been hijacked by a sort of like, or like captured by very partisan administrations? Once you basically have a legal system that's been politicized, then it's very hard to like basically evaluate like legal rulings. Anyway, so my person going down is Biden for reasons. Is he at the bottom yet? No, he's not. But I think, unfortunately,
he's going down to the bottom.
He's going down to the bottom. We're running out of people to put at the bottom.
You talk and I'll move those two. Okay.
And my person going up, and again, we've done a video on this, so I'll point you to it. It's over on TLDRU, is Geert Wilders. And Wilders is going up not because he won the Dutch election last year. He obviously did. But because polling, albeit from December, but there's good reason to think this polling has continued. The polling for Wilders has gone up recently, and polling from December suggests that he would win an extra 10 seats if the election were held today, mostly at the expense of the VVD, who are the centre-right party who've been in power for most of the last few years, or like the main party in coalition, previously led by Mark Rutte, and now led by a new leader who's far less popular. So that's my person going up. Who is yours going up?
I'm moving Fumio Kishida up, Japanese Prime Minister, who's been at the very bottom of our board for some time now. Finally moving him up one spot. And this is off the back of we made a video about this and talked about it on the podcast before, where there's been this big scandal in Japan surrounding the LDP, the ruling party, all about undeclared political fundraising and kickbacks to politicians and all sorts of stuff. You should watch the video if you're interested. But that saw Kishida's approval crater and the LDP's polling numbers start to drop as well to like record low levels. but it's starting to look like he might be able to turn things around because he took this kind of gamble and said, look, for reference, the LDP has lots of factions in it. It's quite a factional party. He said to try and kind of push the party into reforming itself, I'm going to dissolve my faction. So he announced that. Now other factions, including the Arbe faction, which is the biggest one and most powerful one, is also going to dissolve. And so he might be able to turn himself into the kind of person who fixes the party rather than being like a symbol of its corruption, I suppose. So if he manages to do that, that would be pretty good for him. And there's some signs his polling is getting better. His approval in one poll went up 3 points from 20 to 23%. Yeah. So that's positive, I suppose. Still pretty low. And I personally don't think he'll survive the year as prime minister, but I think he's in a better position now than he was a couple of weeks ago.
It's a very tentative up.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. But it gives us some space on the board. I'll get my sock out camera. Anyway, I think that is everything. Unless I've forgotten another section. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully see you again either on Thursday if you want this podcast, or on Tuesday if you want the slightly less educational TLDR UK podcast. But thank you very much for watching, and hopefully see you again sometime next week.
Bye. Wow. Taking shots to the UK.